Good morning, and welcome to the 8th Annual Safe Streets Summit. My name is Nick Uren, and I'm the Executive Director for the Palm Beach Transportation Planning Agency. Thank you for joining us for the first ever virtual Safe Streets Summit. Even though we can't be together this year in person, we are excited that our virtual platform is allowing for hundreds of people within the region to gather for such an important conversation. As a reminder, the Safe Streets Summit is a partnership between the Palm Beach TPA, the Miami-Dade TPO, and the Broward MPO, the three entities that are charged with collaboratively planning, prioritizing, and funding transportation projects and services for all of the Southeast Florida region. The topics for this year's summit will help us build safer, more livable streets within the region as we continue to navigate the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic and the events of 2020. The theme of the summit is moving our community forward, focusing on how we can learn from our past and move into a more resilient, equitable, and innovative future of transportation together. We recognize the unique opportunity provided to us this year to do better than just striving to return to normal, to instead challenge ourselves to be bold, to be creative, and to work together with fellow transportation leaders, community members, and elected officials to make the Safe Streets vision for our region a reality. Despite the pandemic, this has been an impressive year for advancing safer transportation networks throughout the region. The Southeast Florida Chambers of Commerce facilitated a regional transportation summit, and Palm Beach County hosted a county-level mobility summit, indicating a heightened level of awareness and commitment to our collective transportation future. We're investing in new Brightline stations in Aventura and Boca Raton. We're exploring additional passenger rail services on the FEC Railway regionally, and we're making significant investments in transportation safety at grade crossings along the FEC in northern Palm Beach County as part of the double tracking of that project. Both roadway capacity and maintenance projects are increasingly including safety and active transportation elements in their scopes of work. Major transit capital projects are securing federal and state discretionary grant funding, and local transit projects to remove barriers to entry are advancing to implementation. And FDOT, the Florida Department of Transportation, has committed to the establishment of a collaborative process that will allow county and city projects to pursue federal safety funds, advancing the core mission of this summit. We have an incredible program for you this year. Yesterday, we already heard from local champions through our pre-conference sessions about the impactful work that's taking place across our region. Today, we have dynamic plenary sessions featuring national and international leaders in the field who will highlight best practices and strategies while also inspiring us to incorporate these actions into our plan for the region. Don't forget to cast your ballot for this year's People's Choice Award for the Best Complete Streets Project. You have until 12:30 p.m. to vote within the conference attendee hub, and then tune in at 12:50 p.m. for the live announcement of the 2021 winner. Now, let's go ahead and kick off the 2021 Safe Streets Summit with our opening session. I'm going to hand it off to Jessica Jennings, the Associate Legislative Director for Transportation and Infrastructure with the National League of Counties, to introduce our first plenary session. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Nick, and good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to welcome you to the opening session of the 2021 Safe Streets Summit. As Nick just said, my name is Jessica Jennings. I serve as the Associate Legislative Director for Transportation at the National Association of Counties. It's great to be here with you today for the day's first panel. It is entitled The View from Here, Where Are We Now? Today's panelists are going to focus on how, in an increasingly dynamic environment, we can get back to normal and what that new normal might look like for the transportation industry following COVID-19. Our speakers will reflect on the use of streets and transit pre- and post-pandemic, discuss how data is shaping current best practices, and examine how these items can inform the advancement of better, more inclusive mobility solutions. I want to remind our participants that you can ask a question at any time today by typing it into the chat box that is on the right of your screen. At the end of our presenters' presentations, we will take as many questions as we can. So let's get started. We'll do some introductions. First, we have Zabe Bent. Zabe is the Director of Design for NACTO, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Her background in design, planning, and engineering influences her focus on street design with network operations and policy analysis in order to ensure sustainable, equitable access to urban places. Zabe led the development of NACTO's guide, Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery, and also manages its training program. Before NACTO, Zabe was principal planner at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority and principal at Nelson Nygaard. She holds a master's in both city planning and transportation from MIT, and she spends her free time writing, sketching, and procrastinating, which is a new term that has become much more popular during COVID. So I'm learning a lot more about it. Very interesting. And then after Zabe, we have Beth Osborne. Beth is the director of transportation. For America. Previously, she was at USDOT, where as the acting assistant secretary for transportation policy, she managed the Tiger Bill discretionary grant program, the Secretary's Livability Initiative, and the development and implementation of the Surface Reauthorization Bill. Before joining DOT, Beth worked for Delaware Senator Tom Carper as an advisor for transportation and trade, and as the LD for environmental policy at the Southern Governors Association. She began her career in the House of Representatives, me too, Beth, as a legislative assistant for Rep. Ron Plink of Pennsylvania and LD for Rep. Brian Baird of Washington State. So needless to say, we've got some really impressive and talented panelists with us today. So let's get started. Beth, I think you're up first.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be with everyone. As I was introduced, I'm Beth Osborne. I'm the Director of Transportation for America. We are a national nonprofit focused on creating a transportation system that connects people to jobs and essential services by multiple modes of travel, no matter their financial means or their physical ability. We do our work through several means, including direct technical assistance to those trying to achieve that result, through research and analysis of the existing system, and also through policy development and advocacy. We're also known for several of our reports, and part of my team includes the National Complete Streets Coalition, which I know folks in Florida are very familiar with because we are responsible for a report called Dangerous by Design. So we're going to start off there, move to the next slide. Dangerous by Design is a report that looks at the increasing level of danger for people outside of a car, particularly pedestrians, caused by the design of our roadways. Basically, the way we design our roadways is so focused on moving vehicles and moving vehicles quickly that it immediately creates dangers. Having cars move quickly means mistakes are easier, means mistakes are more likely to have big impacts. If you're traveling at high speed, your scope of vision is much narrowed. As you speed up, you can see less and less of the roadway. At high speeds, conflicts are more dangerous. A lot of our rules and our designs are based on highways, but we've taken those designs and we've brought them down to the community level and created a lot of opportunity for conflict. Now, I did not include the Florida specific numbers here, but the state is quite a standout. It is the most dangerous state for pedestrians, and by a lot, by generally 2 times as much as the second ranking state. It generally includes 8 of the top 10 most dangerous cities for pedestrians. And Florida has been the reigning champion of pedestrian fatalities for at least the last decade. Most dangerous is not actually based only on fatalities, but on fatalities based on the rate of walking. So you're really capturing how dangerous it is for every person out there walking with our rankings. But it does leave out some people who choose not to walk because it's terrifying or it's incredibly inconvenient. So the problem is even bigger than this report lets on. If we move on to the next slide, I'll let you all know that we have a new Dangerous by Design coming out next month. We are busy analyzing the data released by the USDOT in December, and we're writing that report. But you all are the first to get a sneak peek of the initial findings. This is the first time anybody outside my office has seen this. So let me say this is incredibly preliminary. We are still going through all the bugs, in the data. But the top line information is nothing has gotten any better. And I will also guarantee you, particularly in Florida. We are challenged, frankly, to figure out how to write a new report when nothing has changed. We could almost just update some numbers and release the last report with all the exact same language. The number of people struck and killed each year has increased 45% between 2010 and 2019. The latest years of data are 2018 and 2019, but those were the two deadliest years for people walking since 1990. Approximately 4 out of 5 of the 100 largest metropolitan statistical areas got more dangerous since the last report. And older adults, people of color, and people walking in low-income communities continue to be a disproportionate group represented in fatal crashes. Now, as I mentioned, this is 2019 data because it takes several months, most of the year, for the U.S. government to fix all the data they receive from the states. So if we move on to the next slide, we only have anecdotal information about what happened in 2020. It's a very interesting year, but we won't have full data until probably October. What I can tell you is the National Safety Council put out a release in, I believe, August, showing that the first 6 months were quite dangerous. The U.S. experienced an estimated 20% jump in the death rate. So even though traffic had fallen, the number of people being killed based on the number of people on the road jumped by almost the amount that the traffic fell. The number of deaths was just, I believe it was up 17%. And this is because without traffic congestion, people go the speed that the roadways are designed to accommodate. People are extremely in tune with the design cues that the road sends them. If it's wide and clear and straight, that is an indication that you get to go fast. In fact, that's the reason our interstates were built that way, is to clue you into this is the place where you can go fast. Unfortunately, we just took those standards and applied them to the roads that go through your neighborhoods as well. The idea of safety in transportation engineering is that people need to be able to regain control of their car if they lose control without running into any other cars. Now, we could make it easier for them to just go slowly by creating a design that says don't go so fast, but we don't like to do that. So right now, our only real speed reduction strategy is traffic congestion. And we're very focused on removing that. And because of COVID, we saw it go down a great deal. So jumping to the next slide, our default one-size-fits-all approach really pushes speed. And as you can see, a crash with a person, it becomes extremely deadly as those speeds go up. Those high speeds create a problem for clearly the pedestrian who is at much greater risk, but it's also creates a bit of a speed trap for the driver. It says go fast, ignore the speed limit, pay attention to me, the design, and then when you do it, we're going to punish you for it. It's an unfair trick created by the design that requires people to be educated and enforced out of the activity or the behavior that the design is telling them to do. Florida loves focusing on education and enforcement rather than engineering. They really, the Florida DOT chafes when you bring up the third E of engineering. But I would say it's a big failure if you have to educate people on how to use your roadways. And it's a big burden to put on the police to ask them to enforce people out of doing what your own design told them to do. If we jump to the next slide, I'm just going to show you some of the things buried in your own rules in Florida and often across the country. Just basic things like saying that the lanes have to be 12 feet, which is a highway lane width. Going through a neighborhood makes it wide, gives that feeling of wide openness, encourages that speed. A much safer design is 10-foot lanes. Shrink those lanes down. When you feel hemmed in, you don't want to go as fast. You're more comfortable traveling at a pace that is appropriate for an area where there are people crossing the street or cars crossing the street. You know, the reason on highways it can be wide and fast is because we have special ramps to bring you onto the roadway, to bring traffic in safely at high speeds. But we're taking that highway standard and applying it in a place it doesn't make sense. Now, a lot of what we do focusing on speed leaves a bunch of people out. Jumping to the next slide, I'll point out one of the groups that's left out, and that's people who are seeking to catch the bus, often kids. This is a group of kids waiting for their school bus, people trying to cross the street, people trying to drive across the corridor. Jumping to the next slide, I'll point out the person in the upper left-hand side. If you can see that little speck, that is a human being. And if they want to cross the street, I challenge you to find where that's possible. But if he doesn't walk a half mile or a mile to find a safe crossing and then walk back a mile or half mile, he's breaking the law. And then we say that he just doesn't want to walk. People don't want to walk in this area. I will say that, again, as a driver, I see roads like this all the time. And I was recently driving down a highway, a state highway, very much like this one in Virginia. And the speed limit changed 5 times during my trip. It went anywhere from 30 miles per hour to 55 miles per hour, but the design never changed. And that is perfectly acceptable in our engineering standards, which again, basically means we are comfortable fooling and tricking our drivers, a really unpleasant side effect of our thoughtless approach to transportation design. Now, all of this is done because we're desperately trying to make things convenient for the driver. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time just talking about how well we've accomplished that goal. So jumping to the next slide, the way we design our communities and our roadways means people have to drive more. So for their convenience, they can spend more time in their car and drive further. Traveling more? Well, we'll just let you go faster as a consolation prize. Prioritizing speed doesn't make driving easier. It actually makes auto-centric communities that are often driver hostile, driver unpleasant. You're driving fast, you have to look for people coming out of driveways, crossing people. It's very scattered. It's not designed to help you out. Jumping to the next slide. This is the standard we use when we design roadways, and it's basically only looking at drivers, and it's only looking at how crowded the cars are and how fast or slow they go. And it's only looking at it within a particular area. We don't measure your trip. So if you go at a slow speed but arrive in 10 minutes, that's a failed trip. But if you go at a high speed and don't arrive where you're trying to go for 40 minutes, that's a success. In fact, according to the way we measure traffic, if you drive in circles at speed and never arrive at your destination, that is a success. And that's where we are in a lot of our designs. If you go on to the next slide, we can see the waste caused by this. For you to trigger that F level, as we all know from school is failing, you only need to go above that F line for a minute, maybe a couple of minutes. And that needs intervention immediately. And lots of money spent to fix, even though for the rest of the day, there's tons of capacity on the roadway. It's because the biggest fear our DOTs have is that cars might slow down for any point of time at any time during the day, no matter how many people are on the road. What's interesting, and this is considered an economic measure, and if we jump onto the next slide, if you are a transportation professional, the road on the left is an F. You can't get down it very easily. It's slow. The road on the right is an A. But if you're a public official or a leader or an economist looking at the jobs created, the economic activity, the A on the right is really the F. That is a failed corridor where there's just not enough activity to generate jobs and income and taxes to support the infrastructure. And the transportation failure on the left is actually an economically vibrant area. Moving on to the next slide, I will point out that a lot of what we saddle transportation with is a failed land use design. If we build communities like they had been built from the beginning of human civilization up until about World War II, you cluster all the things people need in one place. And even if it's a long trip in to that cluster, that town center, you can do everything you need to do there. But if you take people and spread them out from each other, spread them out from everything they need, and spread everything they need out for each other, what you've done is created the most efficient way to generate traffic congestion with the fewest number of people. And moving on to the next slide, I will say we have been trying to build our way towards this this auto freedom that we've been seeking for decades. And since 1993, this is 1993 through 2017, we looked at the largest 100 metropolitan areas, actually urbanized areas, and we saw that while population growth increased by 32%, freeway growth in those areas increased 42%, and traffic congestion increased by 144%. So even building tons of highway doesn't get us to that goal. Even building those fast roads that are dangerous and kill people doesn't get us to the goal we're seeking. Jumping to the next slide, I can show you that people have tried all kinds of different strategies, but even where population has been lost and a little more roadway has been added, congestion is increased. So at some point, you got to figure that maybe we stop spending billions of dollars on something that doesn't work in any community in America. In fact, in the largest 100 area metropolitan or urbanized areas, the least increase in congestion was 60%. In Miami, the population increased 48%, freeway capacity increased 294%, and congestion increased 186%. I love the commitment, but it's a commitment to a failed approach. And at some point, someone really has to realize it. So I'm just going to finish up by talking about a different way to look at things. Going on to the next slide, we now have the technology to measure whole trips and how much access people have to the things they need. This is looking at Madison, Wisconsin, that can, using GIS and traffic congestion data and the transit feed, the GTFS feed on transit service, and some proxies for walking and biking, can determine how many jobs you can get to in a region or non-work necessities you can get to from every census tract, and can measure every potential trip in just a matter of hours. As you can see, Madison does great by car. If you jump to the next one, not quite as great by transit, but still pretty good coverage. You can overlay areas of poverty here and see which areas have the least good transit connections, and that can be very informative on where you make improvements. The next slide is the one that, my last one, and the one I really want to have people think about, which is this is access to essential services. That's groceries, banks, recreation, healthcare, schools, all those sorts of things that we need as part of our daily life. And it's very weighted towards the walking access, because these tend to be very short trips, 3 miles and less. Some are just across the street. When I lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I remember living 2 lots over from a grocery store that I couldn't walk to because there was no way really to walk along the street, and there was a wall that separated us. So I'd have to shimmy over the wall with my groceries to get there. These are very simple, very cheap changes that means you don't have to drive 2 doors down. And that is going to help a lot, not just in terms of reducing traffic congestion, but in saving people money, in reducing how much infrastructure government has to build, in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in increasing the amount people can walk and be active, in decreasing pollutants that cause asthma and other problems. I mean, this one measure captures so many benefits to the community that it's incredibly powerful. And shifting to this would result in a very different approach to design. So I encourage folks to look into it. I'll throw into the chat how to get more information on it. And at that point, I will turn things over to Zabe.
Good morning, everyone. As Beth and Jessica said, my name is Zabe Bent. I'm the Director of Design at NACTO. And I just wanted to take a moment to walk through what we're seeing from the city perspective. And next slide, please. Some of you might know and recognize us from our annual conference, Designing Cities, but we're also an organization of more than 80 city transportation and transit agencies, many of which are located right here in South Florida, where most of you are. Next slide, please. So I just want to flag for everyone that NACTO's mission and the members that are part of NACTO is to build cities as places for people with safe, sustainable, accessible, and equitable transportation choices that support a strong economy and vibrant quality of life. That quality, next slide, that quality of life changed drastically in March. To date, nearly 440,000 people have died. And we've marked a record deaths on just 2 weeks ago, where nearly 4,400 people died in a single day. That doesn't begin to touch the hundreds of thousands of people who've been displaced and the millions of jobs lost and the overall emotional toll. And as transportation professionals, our job is to make sure that people have mobility to the places that they need to go and the places that they need to be, whether they're essential workers or whether they're simply walking in their neighborhood to get lunch or what have you. We saw, next slide, we saw cities adapt and response in the response period, especially whether they're in transit agencies, next slide, or they're creating walking and biking lanes and expanding sidewalk areas, next slide, or providing essential services in the street, really changing the way that people are using the streets and being responsive, because the streets are a part of our public space network. Next slide, please. We collected information about the many different ways that cities were responding to the pandemic. And because of our vast network, because of support from our different funders, we were able to stand up what we're calling a transportation response center. And it helped us to collect not just the sort of overall activities that cities were doing, but how they were doing it, and helping cities to set precedent and to identify precedents to use the streets differently at this point. And we pushed out a lot of that information and then stood up a range of different support services and toolboxes and webinars, et cetera, as well as the resource, which is still ongoing, the Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery. Next slide, please. For this one, we wanted to make sure to capture the variety of activities that different cities were undertaking. And it was really encouraging to see that cities could find different ways to use the streets. As city transportation leaders, our job is not to return to the inequitable, dangerous, or unsustainable patterns of the past, but really to help shape a better future, because the cities we create today will provide the foundation for the way that we recover as we move forward. And again, that innovation that we saw in our streets was really helpful and encouraging to see for a lot of people, not just in the industry, but also, of course, for the communities that we serve. Next slide, please. So one of the things we did is launch our first city grants program with support from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And this program was specifically aimed at delivering innovative projects for Black, Latina, and Indigenous peoples who've been suffering disproportionately from the impacts of the pandemic. And we were able to provide 10 cities with about $25,000, not just to improve mobility and access for marginalized groups, but to reach beyond the typical path and pace of project delivery. The goal was not just to get money directly to cities, especially those cities that were not touched by the federal grants process, but also to encourage the flexibility and innovation that has been so very necessary for pandemic response and recovery. In addition to that, we wanted cities to focus on the relationships that they've built with community partners. And so each of these cities were required to propose not just as a city organization, but with a community partner to show that they had engagement and stewardship underway and were willing to work to figure out what are the ways that these specific communities need their mobility improvements touched and improved. Next slide, please. Even still, we saw from all of the cities that we worked in, that traffic safety remained a top priority. While most cities were focused on the different ways that we could use the streets, there were many cities that were also looking at just simply how to improve the trends that Beth was describing in terms of traffic fatalities and speeds on our streets. It remained a high priority for community members, even amidst the glitz and glamour of projects like open streets and open outdoor dining. Next slide, please. In the case of Oakland, we saw that there's a lot of focus on Oakland's Open Streets program, and the city received a lot of feedback from the communities as they started to roll out these programs, slow streets, open streets, shared streets in different cities across the country. But in Oakland, they found that traffic safety was continuing to be an important issue in communities that they were working in. And they began to pivot the program based on the feedback that they were receiving. And this is another component that we're seeing in terms of innovation, is the willingness to adjust and refine as we go forward with the pandemic, with the various needs that different cities and communities within those cities have. Next slide, please. Even still, across the US, traffic volumes are down for the most part, and we're seeing that crashes are up. And part of that is because there's more space on the streets. It gives people license to travel much faster. And as Beth was noting, we are not necessarily sending the right cues to different drivers and communities with the way that our streets are designed. That is on us as professionals in this industry. It's our job to figure out what are the best ways to send the right cues to drivers without confusing them, and making sure that it's legible to the driver, to the pedestrian, to the cyclist, to the transit rider, and anyone who's on the street, where they should be and what kind of environment they should be operating within. Across the US, we saw those, again, next slide, please. We saw traffic deaths the rate of traffic deaths per 100 million miles increasing again. And those fatalities and the severities of crashes increased. Next slide, please. Again, part of the reason for this is that we are sending the wrong cue. If you think about the way that we work through our safe speed limits and the notion of what a speed limit is to most people, I know, especially having gone to high school in South Florida, I know many people drive at the speed limit or above it. That is their target, not their limit. It's their goal in many cases. And the way that we set speed limits now is based on driver behavior, not based on our policy goals for safety, for sustainability, or simply for quality of life. And what that means is every time we increase speed limits, we're saying that the people who were driving above the speed limit, that's fine, you're now legal. Your actions are fine, we're going to encourage more of that. Instead of saying we're going to set our speed limits based on, next slide, please, based on the way that people actually get around, the goals that we have for safety and for quality of life and for accessibility, quite honestly. This year, we also released a document called City Limits that looks at the different ways and different opportunities that people have to set speed limits based on a safe speeds approach. Next slide, please. And we saw many cities react. Many of this work was in the pipeline. All of our documents are written by cities and for cities. So we collaborated with them to understand, what do you need to do in order to advance this project, this initiative? And we saw many cities really take up this charge in the past few months. And in fact, it's a continuing trend. Next slide, please, where we see more and more cities continuing to advance this work and to look at setting speed limits based on the context and the goals that they're trying to achieve, all in an effort to advance their work to make streets safer. Next slide, please. So what does safety actually mean? Safety from what? Safety for whom? This is something that I think we all need to remember. I'm an engineer, I'm a designer, I'm a planner. I'm also a city resident, and I think a lot of what we do, we have to make sure that we walk the streets and ride the buses, et cetera, to understand who's getting around, how they're getting around, and the quality of life and the experience that we're creating for people on our streets. We are members of these communities as well. Next slide, please. When we think about safety, we really need to think about the full complement of what it means to use our streets. Our streets are not just for traveling, but they're places. They're places where people enjoy a drink, or if that's something that's happening in your city right now, or a meal, or simply walk around the neighborhood at lunchtime. or again, they take transit if they're frontline workers, or drive around to get to their destinations. But when we think about this, the streets are also a part of, again, our public spaces and our quality of life experience as we move through the street of many of the different cities that we're in. So if we think about safety in the context of COVID-19 and where we are today, we have seen, again, the number of people, the number of deaths are increasing, and the rate as well. Black residents represent only 13% of the population, but about 34% of COVID-19 deaths. And when I think about all of this information, looking at the impact on Indigenous populations, on Latinx populations, we really need to understand where we are investing in this time, as well as the impact of historic disinvestment or historic impacts over time of where we're even investing today, now, and going forward. Next slide, please. So if we look at how we're impacting the quality of life of people who are moving around in different neighborhoods, I think about things like how likely you are to be struck and killed in the streets as you're crossing the streets, how likely people are to recognize you when you're standing at the crosswalk waiting to cross, whether or not there is a crosswalk there to begin with, whether or not there is a sidewalk to meet you on the other side of that crosswalk, and then overall the historic impacts that are ongoing, or systemic impacts of disinvestment, of roadway design. As Beth was saying, we design our city streets and our arterials very much like highway streets. And this doesn't really make sense. Most people acknowledge that you should not drive as fast or as freely on the highway as you on the city streets as you do on the highway. But the way that we've designed our streets, and particularly in areas that are disenfranchised, really impacts the experience of those environments and their ability to achieve economic investment and economic health, as well as ongoing sustainability and safety. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we looked at when we talked through the Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery was not just skipping to the design, but really putting things in context. One of our first principles that we examined based on the feedback that all of the cities that participated gave us was support vulnerable communities first, especially during a pandemic. You want to understand what is happening on our streets, and we know that transportation is part of the social determinants of health. So when we look at the way that people are using our streets, obviously we saw this summer where these impacts came to a head, where communities took to the streets in more than 150 cities in response to racial injustice. And we also look at the ways that people are designing the streets today. When we think about the outdoor dining program, a lot of people are focused on how do we protect the customers who are dining there. We said, you also have to look at how you're protecting your workers. In this particular case, the workers are the most vulnerable population in this group. So thinking about that, we wanted to make sure that people are looking again at how to design for the communities that are affected and the communities that we're trying to touch. Next slide, please. I'll challenge us to think not just about what we are doing as engineers and planners, that sort of tends to be the focus, but also where the projects that we are conducting are most needed, who benefits from those projects most. And then also to recognize that this is just 4 weekends in January. We are just at the end of our first month of 2021. And it's already just as wacky as 2020 was. And one of the things that I've heard most consistently from people is how to figure out how to design and deliver projects within the context of so many of our regulations, so many of our existing standards. And I just want to remind you, because it's something that has helped me to remember, none of this is normal. None of this should be normal. We don't necessarily have to hold to all of our normal processes. We should be looking at all of our plans and projects and our regulations to say, this was designed for this purpose. Is that serving our purpose now? Is there another way to get this done? What is that way? Next slide, please. Some of the things that we're seeing in other cities is, again, the variety of different types of projects and how people are addressing the needs that we have based on where they are on their curve with pandemic response or recovery, We're seeing a lot of people using streets for school, play, and learning, for housing the unhoused, and creating additional spaces for test sites, what have you. But again, looking at what is the need and how can we use our streets effectively. Next slide, please. I think one of the things that we've seen is a proliferation of slow streets and walk and bike lanes and other types of projects, but we really want to think, how is the creation of a slow street a starting place? What are some of the other things that we can be doing within that street space, not just focusing on simply putting up the barriers and then allowing people to program the space themselves, but identifying some of those uses like school services or food services or testing sites or hopefully vaccine distribution. Next slide, please. So again, I would just say that we need to look at who is traveling now, where are they needing to go, what is the best project that we can do for them. In many cases, frontline workers are not traveling the sort of typical 9 to 5 communities that we tend to design our systems for, our transportation systems in particular. So look at where their needs are, where they are going, not just to the central business district, but to the hospitals, to food distribution centers, et cetera. Next slide, please. And an encouraging reminder, hopefully, that we have the power to create streets for the future, and to remind us that we are creating the foundation for recovery in this moment. Right now, that's what we're focused on. We definitely need to respond to the pandemic, but the types of decisions that we're making now really lead to that future and to the recovery stage. Next slide, please. With that, I'll just say thank you. And I'm here for questions and comments. And also, there will be another session for me, at least this afternoon, if you'd like to tune into that as well. Thanks.
Great. Thanks to both Beth and Zabe today for those great presentations. I did have some prepared questions, but we've got some great ones coming through in the chat. So I'm going to start with those. First, this came in during Beth's presentation. So comment and a question. Amazing that the death rate jumped in 2020, even though the volume dropped due to the pandemic. Although drivers need to slow down and look at the road, should the pedestrians do the same thing before crossing the streets?
So first off, I'm not going to start by blaming the drivers or the pedestrians, because it's the design that's creating the problem in the first place. It should be easy to behave safely. It shouldn't require massive education campaigns and enforcement to get people to do the thing you want them to do. If you want drivers to slow down, build the roads that make driving slow comfortable. You want to make the speed limit the default speed you drive. But what we're doing is we're purposefully playing a government trick on drivers. We're going to entice you, make it easy, make it strange to go slowly, and then we'll punish you when you do exactly what the design told you to do. From the pedestrian perspective, you're in a wild position, especially throughout most of Florida, but throughout a huge portion of the United States as well. Think about that picture with that little tiny black dot up in the upper left-hand corner, a person with no place to cross. What do? Do they walk miles and miles looking for a place to cross? Do they teleport? Do they wear shining, flashing lights to cross the street and be seen? What is the burden on the pedestrian to be visible? The drivers don't know where to look because the design hides the pedestrian. The pedestrian doesn't know how to be seen. You can be looking, but throughout most of our roadways, all that looking does as a pedestrian is make sure you see the car that is coming to hit you. So we've got to do better than that. I think we can look at other areas of our lives for examples. This is not a common area, but anyone who's ever been boating knows there's a pecking order. The more speed you have, if you've got a motorized boat, it's your responsibility to avoid everybody else because they can't move as quickly. And the more small the boat gets, and if it's a sailboat, it gets the right of way. And that actually would apply very well in the roadways as well. I also think about medicine and how far we go to make it easy to use medicine safely. We think about the pill and how it's shaped. We don't want it to look like candy. We think about the bottle to make sure it indicates not just what you're taking, but what the dosage is. We don't make you work hard to figure out how to be safe. That's just what we do on our roadways. And I think we can be better than that.
I think that's a great point. We had another comment that was answered, I think, by both of your presentations, that drivers will ignore speed limits when a city posts a 30-mile-per-hour limit on a 6-lane divided street. It may be safe, but it's not effective. But I think that goes back to your points that the roadway should that should be where the speed comes from, not from the signs on the side of the street. So we've got a couple more, and I will open this up to either one of you who wants to answer. Zabe, why is the widening of highways not the answer?
Oh, I would say that we can widen forever and we would still never fill the need, because basically every time you widen the highway, people say, oh, wow, there's more space. I'm going to drive more, right? So that's one aspect of things. The other aspect of things is that we literally know, as Beth has demonstrated, that it doesn't work. It creates more congestion, and we cannot widen enough. At some point, we're going to hit someone's home. At some point, we're going to hit our favorite park. At some point, we're going to hit, the central business district. At what point do we say we know that there are other solutions? We actually believe that these solutions work. They have been demonstrated to work. And we should try something else. I mean, literally the definition of insanity for many people is doing the same thing over and over and over again with the same result and expecting a different one. We know that it doesn't work. But even still, if we think about the impacts of widenings, we're in a climate crisis right now. We have to consider how much space that we're losing from the actual ground and just the impact that has on the environment, but also the quality of life. We all know that you don't cross highways comfortably anyway. So why would we continue to widen and widen and widen? We know that those impacts exist. There's no purpose in continuing down that path.
I just want to add that, this is not a waterway. A lot of times we're just using waterway principles on our highways. If you widen a creek bed, the water level does go down because no one comes behind you and pours more water in it. But our roadways aren't that way. If you increase the width of a highway or add lanes, people will change their travel patterns because people are logical. Like Zabe said, there's more space. They'll increase their trips. They'll actually add more water. And so that's one reason. I'd also say, just like in my graphics that show those highways encourage development to go further out. They undermine the development that already exists. And that just basically means you drive more. You have to drive alone. You have to add more trips. You have to drive 2 doors down to get to the grocery. Because in making space for people going one direction, we make all other travel on and off the road and around longer and more difficult. Think about that road you go down to that says no left turn all the way down, because your trip is not what matters. It's just that corridor that matters. And anything you do other than go straight disrupts the travel of straight. The goal is not to go straight. The goal is to get you where you're going. It's just not what we measure or value in transportation. We can do better there too.
I would say that the final comment on this is that there is a cost to this, right? There's a cost to continuing to widen the highway. And so we're literally throwing away money by doing something we know will not work. But there's also a cost to other systems, not just to the transportation network, right? When we build all of these, projects that go farther and farther out, now we have to build sewer. Now we have to run water lines. Now we have to run fiber and telephone and all these different things. And we could just improve the communities that we have already. If we spent our money there, we would get a much more efficient return on our investment, and we would create better communities with better safety and better quality of life.
Great. Thank you both for that question. And Zabe, you talked a lot about social equity in transportation during your presentation today. And obviously that's something that Congress and the new administration are starting to try to tackle. HR2 had a lot of, incentives for building roads, to underdeveloped neighborhoods and whatnot. So we do have a question related to that. So how do we correct these wrongs from the past? If a highway was built through a historically Black neighborhood, for example, we can't just tear down the highway, or can we? Or what is, kind of the best practices for a community that is looking to revitalize these communities, but there's literally a structure in the way?
So I think there's a lot of debate on this particular topic. And I think that debate is healthy and important. I think it depends on the highway and it depends on what your options are. The first thing that we can do is, can we take a lane or 2 or 3 from that highway and dedicate it to transit, dedicate it to biking? Can we repurpose that facility, right? That's one thing that we absolutely should be looking at. No new structures, no new infrastructure should be built that does not include pedestrian, bike, and transit investment. There is literally no reason to continue building car-only surfaces. But for the surfaces that we do have, repurposing them is the first thing that I think we should be looking at. The other thing we should be looking at is, if we tear it down, what would the impact be on the overall structure that's there, the sort of the neighborhood structure that's sitting underneath it or sitting around it? Can we reknit the neighborhoods there? What would that look like? Again, if you're tearing down a highway, I think we want to look at what are the travel patterns that are going to persist. Some trips are going to move to a completely different place. Some trips will remain in that area. Can we convert some of those trips to transit and biking so that, again, it's not just creating more surface area, but it has an opportunity to create parks, to reknit neighborhoods that have been divided for so long, and it sends the message that we're investing and correcting some of our past wrongs. And I know Beth gave a talk on this yesterday in her session, so I'm going to let her jump in.
I did. So I grew up in New Orleans. In New Orleans, every major metropolitan area has what we called an urban renewal highway that renewed the urban area by clearing Black and brown neighborhoods. And my city is an example of that. There's a corridor that goes through the Treme neighborhood, and they built an expressway called the Claiborne Expressway through there. And it's referred to as the monster by those locally because it's so huge and hulking and divides the community. And one of the things that I did when I was at USDOT was fund a planning effort to look at taking it down. And we discovered that there were several difficulties. One is the models that we use to determine what will happen with traffic, which were developed by the best technology available in 1955, aren't up to the task. And we've demanded so little of our transportation sector that there's been no push to update those tools for the incredible technological gains that we've made over the last 70 years. So our models can't tell when a trip might go away. It can't consider that you might shop online. If you took the trip this year, you will never change your behavior, so those trips must stay. They also must stay in the car. And if you take down the highway, they must stay in the corridor because we've programmed our models to just do that, not because of anything else. And so what it does is it says, oh, this person can no longer go 55 miles per hour on an elevated highway. Clearly, they will choose to go down 15 mile per hour disconnected local streets with tons of, if you've been in New Orleans, with potholes that you could lose a child in. That's illogical, but that's what the models show. So one problem they ran into is when they modeled taking it down, they show that all the local streets were going to be flooded. Well, that's never happened in a takedown, but we don't like to learn in transportation. We don't look at those past takedowns and adjust our models. We just stick with our models and our projections. So we proposed updating those models. We've also proposed just providing money to make it possible to make the improvements to take these things down. And also recognizing that one of the most upsetting things I learned in New Orleans was the local residents were afraid they'd be priced out of the neighborhood because the only thing that was keeping their property values low enough to be affordable was the thing that had destroyed their property values. And I found that to be just beyond a Greek tragedy and an unacceptable reason to not make someone's neighborhood beautiful. So we're also proposing a land trust that allow those locally to be able to buy into their land and benefit from the improvement. And a lot of these ideas have been taken up on Capitol Hill, and there's a proposal for at least the highway takedown part, but we're working with folks on the land trust and the modeling improvements as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that example. I think people always understand better when you can give them a concrete example of how this is happening in practice. So we have just a few minutes left, and we have some really great questions. So I'm going to give you both about 2 minutes, and I'm going to give you 3 questions. So From your experience in working with local governments, how did they fund Safe Streets? I think that's really important. You know, from the county perspective, it always comes down to funding. I know that's the same for cities, you know, every level of government. So how did they fund it? How were folks able to get buy-in from local stakeholders to implement Safe Streets? And then how can we expedite the process of aligning our traffic standards with complete street goals? So I know that's a lot. I won't hold it against you if you don't answer all of them, but Zabe, why don't we start with you?
I would say that we find funding for many of our car-oriented projects, and we don't balk at how expensive they are in some cases. Most of these projects are cheaper. So repurposing the way that we spend our money is one thing, and creating different metrics, as Beth was suggesting, is one way to look at that. In terms of getting the buy-in, I think we have to talk to people to actually explain what the project is, why it's going to work. Hopefully it is the right project, and figure out how to explain and sort of bring people along. A lot of times we do outreach as a way for engagement, and outreach and engagement are not the same thing. Engagement sponsors discourse, it sponsors learning on both sides, and it also sponsors stewardship and ongoing partnership with that community to figure out how do we move forward, what they care about, and then figure out how to tailor the project. The final thing I'll say in terms of messaging, this is something that seems so obvious, but for some reason we are not getting it. We talk about safety, we talk about quality of life, we talk about all these different things. When I actually go out to communities and I talk about specific projects, and I did this in many different cities, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, would specifically say to someone, your inconvenience of a few seconds, is it really worth someone's life? That is literally what we are talking about here. And most people will get it. But right now we sort of use different terms and we figure out, you know, sort of talking around the problem. Let's get specific. At this intersection, you know, the delay would be 2 minutes extra or 20 seconds extra. No matter what that number is, it is not worth a life. It's not worth the many, many lives that are being lost and impacted every single day. So that is, I think, what we really need to talk about. Let's get specific.
So I will say that the way you afford to build safe streets is you build them safe. All streets. You don't build them unsafely and then retrofit them. You don't build a house to burn and then retrofit it to be fire safe. You just build it right the first time. All money builds safe streets, then you can afford it. Just don't spend any money to build anything dangerous. 2, I think what Zabe said on buy-in is exactly right. I would suggest that the access measure that I mentioned is a really useful one, because it talks about people's real experience as opposed to what we talk about now. You know, what the level of service will be bad. What the heck is level of service? That means nothing. This stretch of your trip will be slightly less convenient. The question is, can you reach the things you need within the period you need? And if you measure things according to a measure that makes sense, then the trade-off doesn't look as bad and it all makes more sense and you can get buy-in. And lastly, in terms of aligning design with the safety, it's really about making it easy for the engineer to do the right thing. I'm criticizing the industry, but I've worked with so many engineers at FDOT that are frustrated by the fact that it's so hard to build this way. That if they want to build a roadway that's convenient to walk or bike on, they have to go through a massive fight within FDOT to get exceptions to the rules, and then they get punished for how long the project takes. We want to make it easy for the driver to drive safely. We want to make it easy for the pedestrian to behave safely. We want to make it easy for the engineer to build safely. Let's make that the default and make it not the exception to build and design for safety.
Great. Thank you guys so much. This has been such an interesting conversation. For me, it's interesting to learn kind of these fundamental thinking that underpins our transportation decisions, and maybe it's not in the right place, and definitely something that needs to be reevaluated. So before we close, please don't forget to complete the evaluation for this session by going to the link in the session description or by visiting the conference evaluation section at the top of your event lobby. I hope you'll stay tuned for our next panel on how cities can adapt and evolve to meet the transit demands of the future. That begins after a short break at 10:15. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks again to our audience, and have a great rest of your conference.